September 3rd, 1939. It was a quiet Sunday across most of Germany. But in London and Paris, war had just been declared. France and Britain had drawn a line. After Hitler invaded Poland 2 days earlier, the world finally said, enough. For the average German, it didn't feel like the start of a global catastrophe. Many remembered the last war all too well. The hunger, the trench deaths, the shame of surrender. And yet, in 1939, there was a strange sense of confidence. Germany wasn't broken anymore. The cities were humming with jobs. The trains ran on time. The streets were clean. But to understand how things got here, you have to go back. Way back to 1933. Back then, Germany was in ruins. Not physically, but mentally, economically, spiritually. The First World War had ended in 1918, but what followed wasn't peace. It was humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany for everything, forced it to pay billions in reparations, took away land, colonies, pride. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democracy, tried to hold the country together. But it was chaos. Inflation hit so hard in the 1920s that people needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy bread. By the time the Great Depression arrived in 1929, Germany had more than 6 million unemployed. That's nearly 1 in 3 workers. The crisis wasn't just about money, it was cultural too. Cities like Berlin became symbols of wild nightlife, sexual freedom, and new art. Some loved it. Many others, especially in the countryside, saw it as a sign of decay. They missed the old order. They feared liberalism and communism. They wanted someone strong to take control. That's when Hitler stepped in. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, he turned a fragile democracy into a one-party dictatorship. The Reichstag fire gave him the excuse to crack down on dissent. Political parties were banned, unions crushed, newspapers censored. But for many ordinary Germans, life seemed to get better. The streets felt safer. Jobs returned. Massive public works projects, like the Autobahn, put people back to work. Hitler promised a car in every garage, the Volkswagen, the people's car. Even those who didn't love the Nazis often stayed quiet, because things were finally working again. By 1935, the Nazi regime had fully reshaped daily life. Education, art, work, even leisure, all now carried a political message. Everything was meant to serve the state, and the state served one man. From the outside, it looked like order. But underneath, it was fear, surveillance, obedience, and the slow erasure of everything that didn't fit the Nazi image of a perfect German life. So when war finally broke out in 1939, many Germans didn't feel they were starting a war. They believed they were continuing a victory, a national revival. But they had no idea what price would be paid, or how much of their own freedom had already been lost. Ideological foundations of Nazi society. What made the Nazi regime so powerful wasn't just guns, tanks, or speeches. It was an idea, a story they told again and again until people started believing it. The Nazis claimed Germany had lost its way. They blamed the chaos of the Weimar years on modern ideas, freedom of speech, women's rights, democracy. To them, all of it was weakness, the collapse of old values. They said Germany didn't need more freedom. It needed strength. The Nazi story was simple but dangerous. Germany was once great, then stabbed in the back by traitors, Jews, communists, liberals. And now, only by returning to its roots could it rise again. That meant building a new kind of society, one built not on law, but on blood. Racial purity was at the center of it all. The Nazis believed in a twisted idea called Aryan superiority. Blonde hair, blue eyes, strong jaw, hard work, discipline. This was the true German, they said, even though Hitler himself didn't fit the image. He was Austrian, dark-haired, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the myth. And the myth said Germans were special, chosen, and they needed more space, Lebensraum or living room, to grow. That space, Hitler believed, lay in the east, Poland, Ukraine, Russia. These lands were rich in soil and resources, but polluted with Jews and Slavs. In Nazi thinking, they were subhuman, not worth protecting. This belief gave them permission, in their minds, to invade, remove, and replace. But it wasn't just foreign nations that were in danger. The Nazi vision shaped everything at home. Art, for example, had to be strong, clean, and heroic. Abstract or modern art, that was degenerate. Jazz music? Banned. Too African, too American. Books were burned. University professors who didn't support the regime were fired. The press was silenced. The only truth allowed was the one approved by the state. What made all this so dangerous was how ordinary it started to feel. These ideas were baked into school lessons, radio shows, posters, songs. Kids grew up repeating Nazi slogans like prayers. Adults learned not to question, or to at least stay quiet. And over time, even people who disagreed got used to looking the other way. Daily life in the Third Reich. Women under the Nazi regime. In Nazi Germany, women were not seen as individuals with rights. They were seen as wombs, mothers, tools for building the future of the Reich. The Nazi slogan for women was simple: Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. That's where they were told they belonged. Not in universities. Not in politics. Not in public life. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, one of their first moves was to push women out of higher education. That same year, they passed a law limiting female university enrollment to just 10% of total students. It didn't matter how qualified a woman was. Her spot was now capped. This was a sharp break from the Weimar Republic era. In the 1920s, Germany had made major progress on gender equality. By 1930, about 20,000 women were studying at German universities and steadily rising. Women were entering professional fields like law, medicine, and teaching in numbers never seen before. But Hitler's government called that progress a threat to the family and the nation. By 1934, thousands of female students were forced to drop out. Female professors were dismissed. Scholarships and fellowships for women were slashed. Nazi propaganda painted educated women as selfish, women who abandoned their true duty of motherhood. Even in high schools, girls' education was redirected. Subjects like home economics and racial science replaced Latin or math. Girls were taught how to raise children, not how to think critically. Political participation for women also banned entirely. Women couldn't hold office. They couldn't vote in any meaningful way. The Nazi worldview had no room for women as leaders or thinkers. Their only job, they were told, was to bear racially pure children, as many as possible. And the regime rewarded them for it. Mothers with many children were honored with the Mother's Cross, bronze for 4 kids, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. It wasn't just a medal, it was status, a symbol that you were doing your duty for Germany. But underneath the praise was control. Birth control and abortion were heavily restricted, except for people labeled unfit. Jewish women, Roma women, women with disabilities, they were often sterilized by force. Some were killed. The Nazis wanted more children, yes, but only from the right kind of woman. Ironically, all this idealization of motherhood clashed with reality. By the late 1930s, Hitler was preparing for war, and war eats up manpower fast. Suddenly, the same regime that told women to stay home needed them in factories, on farms, behind desks. The contradiction was clear. Women were pushed out of work to return to the home, only to be dragged back into the workforce when labor ran dry. By 1939, nearly 14 million women were working, close to 37% of the total labor force, in factories, offices, even as nurses and teachers. They were expected to juggle everything: work, motherhood, and obedience to the state. But even as they worked, they were denied recognition. Wages for women were lower than for men doing the same jobs. Leadership positions? Almost non-existent. And the moment a man could replace them, they were sent back home. This wasn't empowerment. It was exploitation dressed in patriotism. Girls were also targeted young. They were trained them to be loyal, obedient, and ready for motherhood. Their education was narrowed to housework, family duty, and racial ideology. Critical thinking was discouraged. Obedience was everything. The Nazi regime claimed to honor women, but in truth, it used them as symbols, workers, breeders, and propaganda tools. Their worth was tied to how well they fit the Nazi ideal. Step outside that role, and you were erased, punished, or worse. Indoctrination and propaganda. In Nazi Germany, propaganda wasn't just posters and speeches. It was everywhere, in schools, in homes, in birthdays and holidays. Even Mother's Day became a tool of control. Originally a day to honor love and sacrifice, Mother's Day under the Nazis became a national event. But it wasn't about flowers and gratitude. It was about politics. Women who had many racially pure children were celebrated as heroes of the Reich. On May 13, 1934, Hitler himself gave a radio address praising Aryan mothers for producing the future of Germany. It didn't stop there. The entire media system was brought under state control. In 1933, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was created, led by Joseph Goebbels. His goal was clear: every book, film, song, and newspaper had to serve the Nazi message, and the message was everywhere. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a radio, many of them the cheap Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver. These radios were designed to only pick up German stations, ensuring that the public heard only what the Nazis wanted them to hear. Hitler's speeches were broadcast live. Loudspeakers were installed in public squares and factories. People had no choice. If you didn't listen, neighbors noticed, and silence could be suspicious. The Nazis didn't just want obedience, they wanted belief. So they went after the most impressionable group of all: children. The education system was completely rewritten. Textbooks were revised to include racial theory, militarism, and Nazi ideology. Math problems used bullets and enemy soldiers. Biology taught that Aryans were biologically superior. History focused on Germany's betrayal after World War I and Hitler's rise as national savior. In 1933, more than 1/3 of all teachers were already Nazi Party members, far more than the general population. Those who resisted were fired. Others were pressured to conform. Teaching wasn't just a job anymore. It was a form of indoctrination, youth movements and subcultures. Outside the classroom, kids were funneled into Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. These weren't harmless youth clubs. For Nazi, youth weren't just the future. They were the battleground. The regime didn't want teenagers who thought for themselves. It wanted soldiers in training, physically tough, mentally loyal, and emotionally numb to anything outside the Nazi worldview. That's what the Hitler Youth was built to create. Boys joined as early as age 10. They wore uniforms, marched in formation, learned how to handle rifles, dig trenches, and salute with pride. They memorized slogans like "One People, One Reich, One Führer," and chanted songs about loyalty, blood, and sacrifice. Discipline and obedience were everything. By 1939, over 8.7 million young people were enrolled, nearly 90% of Germany's youth. It wasn't optional. Membership was mandatory. Parents who tried to resist risked prison, job loss, or worse. Girls were placed in the League of German Girls. Their training focused less on war and more on racial hygiene, domestic skills, and preparing for motherhood. The ideal German girl wasn't supposed to be smart, outspoken, or curious. She was supposed to be fertile, faithful, and German. But not everyone fit the mold, and not everyone wanted to. One of them is the swing youth, a rebellious subculture of mostly middle and upper-class German teenagers. They listened to band jazz and swing music from America and Britain. They wore their hair long, dressed in English-style suits and skirts, and gathered in secret to dance, smoke, and talk freely. Their lifestyle wasn't just different, it was dangerous. To the Nazis, swing music was racially impure. It had African roots and Jewish influences. It represented the exact opposite of Nazi order: freedom, individuality, and fun. The swing youth didn't praise Hitler. They rolled their eyes at him. That made them a threat. The Gestapo began raiding swing clubs. In 1941, over 300 swing youth members were arrested in Hamburg alone. Some were sent to concentration camps. Others were publicly humiliated or beaten. But they weren't the only rebels. Other groups like the Edelweiss Pirates also resisted. Working-class teens, often from cities like Cologne, they refused to join the Hitler Youth. Instead, they went hiking, wrote anti-Nazi graffiti, and in some cases, even helped Jews escape. A few paid with their lives. The contrast between these groups and the Hitler Youth couldn't be more clear. One side was trained to obey without question. The other, though small and scattered, dared to think differently, and paid the price. But while some youth quietly resisted, most of the country was moving in the opposite direction. Drawn in by the promises of order, jobs, and national pride, the Nazi regime didn't rely on fear alone. It used infrastructure and economic spectacle to win loyalty. Infrastructure and economic propaganda. In early 1933, before Hitler took full control, Germany's economy was in ruins. The Great Depression had hit hard. Nearly 6 million people were unemployed, about 1 in every 3 workers. Jobless men wandered the streets. Families stood in food lines. People had lost faith in the Weimar Republic, and many no longer believed that democracy could fix anything. That's when the Nazis stepped in with a different kind of promise. They promised pride, progress, and work. And they used massive infrastructure projects to sell that dream. The most iconic was the Autobahn, Germany's national highway system. Construction began in earnest just months after Hitler became chancellor. Workers were photographed building roads by hand, swinging shovels under Nazi flags. The images were splashed across newspapers and shown in newsreels. The message was clear: Germany is moving forward again. By 1936, over 130,000 people were employed directly on Autobahn construction, with tens of thousands more in steel, concrete, and engineering jobs. But here's the truth. The economic impact was far smaller than it looked. Most of these jobs were low-paid and temporary. Workers often lived in isolated camps with poor conditions. The roads were built more for propaganda than for practical use. Very few Germans even owned a car. In fact, some stretches of Autobahn sat nearly empty for years. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the image: a working nation, building with purpose. To complete that image, the regime needed something to put on those roads, something every German could dream of owning. That's when the Nazis introduced the Volkswagen, literally the people's car. In 1938, Hitler proudly announced a new automobile for every German family, affordable, modern, and made in Germany. People could buy one by paying in installments through the Strength Through Joy program, known in German as KDF. Over 300,000 Germans paid into the scheme, saving loyally for their promised car, but no one ever received one. As war approached, the Volkswagen factory was converted into an arms plant. It churned out military vehicles instead, often built by forced laborers. The dream of a car for every family quietly vanished. Still, the illusion held. People believed their sacrifice was necessary, even noble. And in a way, it worked. Unemployment dropped dramatically, from 6 million in 1933 to fewer than 1 million by 1939. But the truth behind that number is more complicated. Many were removed from job roles through military conscription, forced labor, and exclusion. Jewish workers were fired, women were pushed back into the home, and make-work programs filled the gaps. Yet while jobs were tightly controlled, so was free time. And that's where KDF showed its true purpose, not just as a car scheme, but as a full-blown system to manage how people worked, played, and thought. Kraft durch Freude, worker welfare and social control. The Nazis didn't just want control in the workplace, they wanted control in people's free time too. That's where KDF, or Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, came in. On paper, it looked like a gift to the working class. Vacations, concerts, sports, art, cruises, theater tickets, all offered at low prices to ordinary Germans. The goal? To create the image of a happy, healthy, and loyal workforce. But behind the fun was a powerful tool of control. KDF was run by the German Labor Front, which replaced all independent unions after they were banned in 1933. It had over 25 million members at its peak. And while it promised joy, it also made sure workers stayed politically quiet. Vacations were the crown jewel of KDF propaganda. In a time when few working-class Germans could afford to leave their hometowns, KDF offered trips to the Alps, the North Sea, and even cruises to Norway or Italy. By 1938, over 10 million people had taken a KDF-sponsored vacation. But there was a catch. Most trips weren't free. Workers paid for them out of their own wages. A portion was automatically deducted. The regime just decided where and how the money was spent. Workers had little choice or control. Sports were also promoted heavily. Football, hiking, gymnastics, all seen as ways to build both strong bodies and loyalty to the Reich. But these weren't just games. They were part of the Nazi ideal of racial fitness. Being healthy wasn't about personal well-being. It was about being useful to the nation. KDF even stepped inside the factory walls with its Beauty of Labor, Schönheit der Arbeit program. The Nazis installed better lighting, cleaner washrooms, and improved lunch facilities, and then proudly advertised it as proof they cared about workers. But again, much of the cost fell on the workers themselves. And the real goal wasn't comfort. It was discipline and productivity. A cleaner factory wasn't just a nicer place. It was a more efficient one. Even the famous Volkswagen was part of KDF's illusion. Workers made small payments toward the people's car, but none were delivered before the war. The project turned into a military production line instead. The regime took the money and gave nothing back. So while KDF offered entertainment and rest, it also blurred the line between leisure and loyalty. It told workers, "We're taking care of you." But in reality, it was taking their independence, their wages, and their choices. And while ordinary Germans were being managed with promises of vacations and cars, a darker process was unfolding beneath the surface. Aryanization of the economy. By the late 1930s, the Nazi regime had reshaped nearly every corner of German life, from work to leisure, from education to entertainment. But their most brutal changes weren't always loud or violent. Some began quietly, with laws, boycotts, and paperwork. Anti-Semitism wasn't just a belief for the Nazi, it was a policy. And nowhere was that policy more visible than in the economy. The Nazis didn't just target Jewish people with hate. They systematically stole their livelihoods through a process called Aryanization. This process began quietly in the early 1930s. At the time, about 100,000 Jewish-owned businesses operated in Germany. They ranged from corner shops and law offices to large department stores and banks. Jews made up less than 1% of the population, but they were often blamed, unfairly, for Germany's economic troubles. The Nazis exploited this resentment. In April 1933, just months after Hitler came to power, the government organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Stormtroopers from the SA stood outside stores, painted yellow stars of David on windows, and intimidated customers. The boycott was short-lived but symbolic, a warning of what was to come. Over the next few years, that warning turned into law. Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, were pushed out of public jobs. Their licenses were revoked. Their names were removed from professional directories. By 1938, Jewish Germans were banned from owning businesses entirely. That year marked a turning point. In November, after a German diplomat was killed in Paris by a Jewish teenager, the Nazis launched Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Across Germany and Austria, over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed, 1,400 synagogues were burned, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. After Kristallnacht, Aryanization accelerated. Jewish property was sold at bargain prices, but not voluntarily. The government forced owners to sign over businesses, homes, and assets to so-called Aryan Germans. Many buyers were Nazi party members, officials, or simply opportunists looking for a deal. The victims received little or nothing in return. Bank accounts were frozen. Exit taxes and fines were imposed. One regulation, for example, forced Jews fleeing Germany to leave behind 90% of their wealth. The process was backed by legal decrees, but the enforcement was brutal. Paramilitary groups like the SA and SS harassed shopkeepers, vandalized storefronts, and terrorized families. Courts offered no protection. Police looked the other way. The system wasn't just unfair, it was violent, coordinated theft. By 1939, the number of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany had dropped from 100,000 to fewer than 7,000, and those that remained were quickly closed or seized once war began. This wasn't just economic exclusion, it was preparation for something worse. By stripping Jews of jobs, income, and homes, the Nazis isolated them socially and economically. It became easier for the rest of society to look away, to see Jews not as neighbors, but as outsiders, with nothing left to lose. That silence made room for the horror of the Holocaust. And that silence wasn't only limited to anti-Semitism. Across Germany, people were learning to keep their heads down. As the Nazis tightened their grip on the economy, they also crushed anyone who dared to speak out. Suppression of opposition. From the moment Hitler became chancellor, the regime moved quickly to crush all political opposition and create a one-party state. Within months, freedom of speech, press, and assembly had disappeared almost entirely. The first targets were clear: communists and social democrats, who had strong support among the working class. After the Reichstag fire in February 1933, the Nazis blamed communists and used the panic to pass the Reichstag fire decree. This law suspended basic civil liberties. Mail could be opened, phones tapped, homes searched without warrants. Suddenly, political opponents could be arrested without cause. But that was just the beginning. A few weeks later, in March 1933, the Nazis passed the Enabling Act, a law that handed Hitler full legislative power, bypassing parliament entirely. With that, Germany's fragile democracy collapsed. Within months, every other political party was either banned, dissolved, or absorbed. By July, the Nazi Party stood alone. the only legal political force in the country. Trade unions were shut down too. Their offices were raided, leaders arrested, and their assets seized. In their place, the Nazis created the German Labor Front, which controlled all worker relations. Strikes were outlawed, wages were frozen. Workers were expected to obey, and many did, because they feared the alternative. This fear was enforced by the Gestapo, the secret police. Their methods were simple: infiltrate, report, punish. Anyone could be a suspect. A neighbor, a co-worker, even a family member could turn you in for an offhand remark. And once you were reported, there was no trial. People simply disappeared. Newspapers became mouthpieces for Nazi ideology. Independent editors were fired or jailed. The Nazi press office approved every article before it went to print. In 1933 alone, over 1,600 newspapers were shut down. So where was the resistance? There was resistance, but it was scattered, quiet, and dangerous. In some factories, workers slowed down production or sabotaged machinery. Some Catholic priests gave sermons that subtly challenged Nazi teachings. A few brave teachers refused to rewrite their curriculum. But organized opposition? There was almost none. Looking back, it's easy to wonder, how could so many Germans go along with it? How did a modern, educated society allow such brutality to grow and remain largely silent while it happened? The answer isn't simple, but it starts with something ordinary: stability. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany was broken. The Weimar Republic had failed to solve massive problems: hyperinflation, crushing war reparations, and unemployment that left families desperate. Nearly 1 in 3 Germans was out of work. Violence between political groups spilled into the streets. People didn't just want change, they were terrified of chaos. So when the Nazis offered jobs, order, and national pride, millions accepted the trade-off. Yes, freedoms were taken. Yes, neighbors disappeared. But for many, life also got better, or at least more stable. The economy seemed to roar back to life. Trains ran on time. Roads were being built. The Volkswagen factory promised a bright future. Germans who had once stood in bread lines were suddenly wearing uniforms and marching proudly in parades. This economic recovery didn't happen by magic. It came through rearmament, forced labor, exclusion of Jews and women from the workforce, and massive state control. But for most Germans, it felt like progress. And that feeling, pride in the country, hope for the future, was enough to cloud moral judgment. Meanwhile, speaking out wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. The Gestapo didn't need a reason to arrest someone, just a whisper, a complaint, even a joke. A school teacher who criticized Hitler could vanish overnight. A factory worker who defended a Jewish colleague might never come home again. Dissent meant risking your job, your family, your freedom, and sometimes your life. So people learned to stay quiet, to look away, to focus on their own lives. Some believed, others simply adapted. And conformity didn't always come from fear. It also came from routine. Indoctrination started young, in schools, in youth groups, on the radio. Children learned not to question. Adults learned not to ask. Over time, the silence became normal. It's important to understand. Not everyone supported the Nazis, but most complied. And that compliance gave the regime its power. This is the chilling truth. A dictatorship doesn't always need mass violence to survive. Sometimes, it just needs people to go along, to keep their heads down, to tell themselves they don't know enough, or that it's not their place. What happened in Nazi Germany was more than a political collapse. It was a moral one. And that's why this history matters. because it shows us how comfort can blind, how fear can silence, and how even good people can become bystanders when the price of speaking out feels too high.